What's up, everybody? In today's video, I'm going to be providing a summary of the book Stretch by Scott Sonenshein. So who is Scott Sonenshein? Scott Sonenshein is a social scientist at Rice University. And he's not well known, obviously, because he's a professor. But I wanted to read this book because it's about utilization of resources and stretching your resources farther than you think you can. And the disease of chasing, or what the author calls chasing. And chasing is where you are always looking to get more, whether that's like in your personal life or professional life, or trying to get more money, trying to get more material objects, whatever it may be. I'm also like kind of frugal, so I wanted to, I guess, support that idea of myself. But I also wanted to learn about how to succeed with what you have, because sometimes in my own life, I feel like I'm always like thinking I'm going to get the next best thing, or the next thing I'm going to get is going to help me get to where I'm going. Like this camera, trying to buy a new camera, trying to buy more lenses for this camera. And it's kind of part of our society as well, right? Our society is trying to create lack in all of us so that we buy more. We think we can't fit in until we get something more. We think we can't succeed in life until we get more money, until we get more resources for a small business. And a lot of times small businesses, they tell you can't succeed without raising a lot of money. So let's go over chapter 1 first. Chapter 1 is a tale. Chapter 1 is basically the introduction for this book, and it's a tale of two beers. And in this chapter, he lays down some pretty important things. And this includes that most people routinely overestimate the importance of acquiring resources, but significantly underestimate their ability to make the use of the resources they do have. So this is what I was just saying, like where you always think you need something more in order to succeed. Second thing he says is that our instincts are having more resources equals getting better results. So this is a common problem for everybody, including myself, is that you think people that have more resources are going to be more successful than you. And it's definitely common in American society, because in America, we're always saying how bad rich people are, because we think because they're rich, they're going to be able to do way more than we can do. And after that, in this chapter, he talks about the story of Dick Yeungling, who is famous from Yeungling beer, which is a pretty popular beer in the United States, and it had to go against a competitor, which was Stroh beer, which is spelled S-T-R-O-H, in case I'm pronouncing that wrong. And Stroh Brewery was started in 1849 in Detroit, and it became pretty successful. At some point, it was like the third largest brewery in the nation, or maybe even the world. And what happened was it went down through the generations, and ultimately I think it made its way to the grandson, and the grandson was like in this completely growth mindset. He wanted to acquire as many companies as possible and spend as much money to get there. And eventually I think they ended up going under, while Yeungling, what he ended up doing is he kept using the same old factories that they had. It's like a 150-year-old factory, and he managed to grow it into like the largest domestic brewery in the United States. So he's trying to illustrate there's one company that had all the resources in the world. At some point they were valued like $9 billion, and yet they still tripped over themselves and managed to spend a lot of money and not get the result they wanted. Where Yeungling was a little bit more resourceful with what they did have and achieve the results they wanted to. And that's pretty much my takeaway from chapter 1. So let's move on to chapter 2. Chapter 2 is called The Grass is Always Greener. And the chapter is about the psychological foundations of chasing more resources. And in this chapter, he talked about something I definitely identified with, which is we all work way too much to buy stuff that we don't need. And to illustrate this, he went through a study, which was really cool. It was like this chocolate bar study. So in this study, they had to listen to music. And while they were listening to music, they had to perform work. And depending on the amount of work that they did, they would get chocolate bars. And so there are some people that are labeled high earners. And if they did push this button 20 times, then they could get a chocolate bar. And there's people that are low earners, and they had to push the button like over 100 times to get the same chocolate. And so what happened is the high earners, press the button enough to get like over 14 chocolates, while the low earners only got about 8 chocolates. And what this showed is that, of course, the high earners earned more chocolate no matter what, but on average they ate like 4 bars, where the other people ate only like 2 bars. So both people earned way more than they used, just because, that's what they were labeled. But then they changed it up after that, and they put a cap on the amount of chocolate bars that you could earn. And so what this did was it actually lowered the amount of chocolate both sides earned. But even then, both sides still earned more chocolate than they ate. So it's just something to keep in mind in your own life. You might be constantly chasing a higher paycheck, a higher promotion. You might not actually need it. You might already be okay and you don't notice. Maybe you need to save more money and you're not even noticing it. You're just earning to spend. So something to make note of. Another thing he talked about in this chapter is it's easy to try to solve more problems with more money. And the example he gives in this chapter is Silicon Valley companies. They're always raising more money, but they don't always profit from it. You have to think of companies like WeWork that recently got its valuation cut in half because there was just way too much hype, but they weren't turning a profit. They're just burning the money, acquiring more buildings and spending on marketing. And if you think about it, it's always easy to spend more money on marketing to just get awareness and revenues, but you have to turn a profit. You have to be able to utilize the money you do have now in order to turn a profit instead of just burning through cash to solve all your problems. So let's move on to chapter 3. Chapter 3 is the basics and the benefits of a stretch mindset. In this chapter, he covers some people that benefited from using a stretch mindset. And he goes over the first story he goes over is this boutique fashion store, and what they did is they gave their employees ownership over their store. So the managers in the boutique could do whatever they wanted with the clothes, basically lay them out how they wanted to and use them how they wanted to. And this one guy, he noticed this dress wasn't selling, so he cut the straps off the dress and then he sold it as beachwear, and then ended up selling way more than other stores. And the owner tried to figure out what happened, and this guy had just took full ownership of it, and he felt okay cutting the straps off the dress because of the way the owners empowered their employees. And how you could utilize this is, whether it's in your business or in your job, if you can get as much ownership over something, then you'll utilize it more. You'll be more creative. Or if you feel like you have no control or ownership over something, then you'll just view it as face value. And that's another theme in this book that you'll see as I go through this. Another thing about this chapter is that he says that constraints create creativity. And this, to me, brought back the book Quit Like a Millionaire. And if you remember that book, I didn't like the beginning where it was a scarcity mindset, because I feel like scarcity mindset limits you. But I guess that's good in this case, because if you limit yourself mentally and limit your options, then you can become more creative with your own resources. And that's something he pointed out in this chapter. And an example that the author provides in this chapter is this lady. She would go to grocery stores and she realized that the fruits and vegetables were discarded if they had blemishes on them. When you go to the store, a banana that's all beat up, or an apple that's beat up, or just any kind of fruit that doesn't look good, you don't want to buy it. And people don't buy it, they just leave it there. And so what she would do, she would go there and buy it off of these grocery stores, and she would make jams and chutneys. And then those jams and chutneys became really popular. So she used a limitation that grocery stores had, and she turned it into a profitable idea. So don't think that you're completely limited, and that's the bad thing. Maybe your limitation is good. You need to think of it in a positive way. Look around you and what's available to you, and you can succeed from that. You don't have to wait till you're a millionaire. You don't have to wait till you're a billionaire. You can succeed right where you're at and just use your creativity muscle. And the last story in this chapter that I really liked is about this CEO at this company called Fastenal. And I'd heard about Fastenal before because I'd seen them on stock exchange and stuff, but I never really knew the story behind them. But the story is the CEO is really frugal. He's not cheap. He's not cheapskate, but he's frugal. He wouldn't pay for employees' meals when they went traveling, and all the furniture in the stores were secondhand. And despite this company achieved insane growth, over 10,000% growth over a certain time period. And you would think if the CEO doesn't want to spend a ton of money on stuff, that they're not going to grow. But it's not true. He's more resourceful. He came up with more ideas of how to grow. He put construction materials like nuts and bolts and vending machines, and these really cool ideas. But the company was run really well too. So that's another thing, is not only was the CEO creative, but also he showed more investment in his business. He cared about his business because He wanted to limit expenses and grow the company. So employees trusted him more. So that's something else you can implement in your own business or your own life. Saving money doesn't always signal bad things. So moving on to chapter 4. Chapter 4 is called Get Outside, the Value of Knowing a Little About a Lot. This chapter is about the breadth of experience can help you solve problems. And to illustrate this, he gives 2 stories in this chapter, one about Netflix and one about a crowdfunding website. And the Netflix story is about this guy, Gavin Potter, who almost won Netflix prize for like $1 million to solve basically the Napoleon Dynamite recommendation model. And the problem was Netflix couldn't figure out how to recommend other videos to people that had watched Napoleon Dynamite, because some people rated it really well and some people rated it really poorly. And what Gavin Potter figured out is, based on behavioral economics that he had read before, and not just economics but also psychology, that what people watched previously greatly impacts the next thing they watch. So if they watched something they liked, they would rate Napoleon Dynamite higher, and if they watched something they didn't like, then they would rate Napoleon Dynamite lower. And this guy had like no algorithm experience, no computer science knowledge. He just like wrote this up, and he didn't actually win the prize, but he ended up helping another team that I think did win the prize. And what the author is trying to show here is that you don't have to be an expert in the field that you think needs to solve the problem in order to solve the problem. And another thing he shows here is that this crowdfunding platform called Innocentive, which is a platform built by Eli Lilly, where they put solutions out there that need solving, like complex scientific stuff, and they leave it open to everybody. What they found out is the further the person's expertise is from the field, like that needs a solution, the better chance that they'll solve it. Because the thing is, when experts come in, they just all try and do the same thing, and they all use the same knowledge. So if one expert can't solve it, it's most likely that all experts in that field can't solve it, because they're all approaching it from, with blinders on, with the same kind of solution. But if somebody else comes in, they have like so many different levels of expertise that they're more likely to solve it. And how this fits into this book is like, it's good to get a lot of experience. Society today tells us to be an expert in some field, but you also need different experiences in life in order to be more resourceful, in order to come up for more uses for resources. So the next chapter is chapter 5. And chapter 5 is called Time to Act. Sometimes we perform better without a script. And the reason he talks about a script in the title is because in this chapter he speaks about Robert Rodriguez, who's well known for like the movie Desperado and Spy Kids. But he talks about his first movie, Mariachi, that he made on virtually no money. He actually did a medical trial to get the cash to make the movie. And that's basically what he means. Like, you don't need a ton of money to make a good movie, because that movie became really popular and made millions of dollars. And he uses that story to highlight a belief that he has, that you shouldn't spend too much time planning, because planning will sometimes stall you out and you'll get analysis paralysis. So you shouldn't always spend too much time planning. And he made a really good point too, which is sometimes you'll be planning for a world that doesn't exist because you'll spend so much time planning. So just get out there and start utilizing the resources you do have. And further to the point, I think what he also means is like, don't plan for a world for, I'm going to get my money in 5 years, and then from the time I get that money, I'm going to be able to execute on my dream in so many years after that. It might be too far away. You might not be able to fulfill your dreams if you wait too much longer. So start working with what you have, and hopefully you can get what you want. And he says that our desire to plan comes from 2 trade-offs that we think we need to make every time. And that is speed versus accuracy. And that's not always true, right? You're not guaranteed accuracy and you're not guaranteed speed. So don't always think you have to make that trade-off. Sometimes there's a middle ground there. And we also have 2 regulatory modes, planning and acting. And a lot of times when you plan, he says you'll second guess yourself, which is not what you want to be doing, right? Like, you don't want to be second guessing everything you're doing. But the more you plan, the more chances you have to second guess yourself. And you can probably just think of some things in your life where you've planned and it hasn't turned out the way you wanted. or you spent too much time second guessing yourself. You never like executed on that thing you wanted to do. So now we'll move on to chapter 6, and chapter 6 is called "We Are What We Expect," and this is all about how our beliefs shape us, and specifically talks about this chapter is expectations for ourselves and others. So in one story he tells in this book is about this one bank called the Bank of the United States. And they were like an okay bank, they were doing okay. But then one person during like a downturn in the economy said that the bank was going under. And he spread that rumor. And then that rumor led to people going in there and taking out their deposits, and ultimately it did fulfill the bank going out of business. And he also talks about the first African American woman millionaire, Madam C.J. Walker. And she invented hair products for African American women, but she did this in a time when there was racism and segregation. But she didn't let that mindset bring her down. She didn't say, I'm an African American woman and I can't do anything with myself. She saw a need in the market and she fulfilled it, and she became a millionaire in a tough time. And it's because she let herself think that she can do anything, and she achieved her dreams. And another funny story from this chapter is about this horse that everybody thought could do math. Because its owner would ask it a math question and it would stomp its hoof and give the right answer in a number of stomps. And then even other people could ask the horse questions. But what people figured out is that the horse was tapping its hoof until the person changed their expression, until they became really happy. So people had expectations that the horse could solve the problem, and it became fulfilled because they changed their own expressions to the horse. And another really good piece of advice from this chapter is like, don't approach all your challenges as threats. Because if you approach your challenges as threats, then it creates rigidity in your mindset, and you won't have as many resources available to you to solve the problems that you need to solve. So those are my takeaways from this chapter. Let's move on to chapter 7. Chapter 7 is called Mix It Up, the power of unlikely combinations. So this chapter is about using different combinations of things to come up with better solutions. We all have multiple identities. We have like our personal identity, and then we have our identities that we take to work. And we always think we have to keep them separate. But what the author shows is that you actually become better if you like integrate these two personalities. At work, if you use the communication skills you maybe use at home, problem solving abilities you use at home, and vice versa. He talks about relationships. It's better in relationships, like if you give each other reviews, like peer reviews, like this is what you've done well in the relationship, and this is what you haven't done well. If you actually have those conversations, relationships will go better. And it doesn't seem like that would work, but he says it actually does. And he says that also, as people, we want to put things in nice little buckets, right? Like this thing applies to this and that applies to that. But life doesn't always work that way. Like things mix together. Things aren't exclusive. Like we label people as like all evil, all good, things like that, or even resources. Like we say, this can only be used for this. We don't view it as something else. And he says you have to like be able to do that and be able to combine things in your life. And he also gives a story in here about Goodyear tires. Apparently the founder of Goodyear tires, he was like messing around with rubber because there was like a rubber craze in the 1800s, and it took him like forever to come up with this ultimate solution. But he did it by like mixing a million different things, and he finally like came up with a solution in his kitchen when he like burnt the rubber, like overheated it or something, and then it ultimately became the rubber that's used in tires because the rubber can stand the heat and the cold, where previously people couldn't find a solution for that. And what he shows through this story is not only unlikely combinations, but like just persisting through tough times as well. But in order to like be able to combine things, you have to be willing to experiment and persist through tough times as well. Let's move on to chapter 8. And chapter 8 is called Avoid Injuries and How to Get the Right Stretch. So this chapter is all about like on the path to stretching. Since the metaphor is stretching here, it's like how not to stretch too far basically. And he says there's 5 common injuries from stretching. And these injuries are, number 1, turning into a cheapskate. Number 2, wandering on the road to nowhere. Number 3, leaping without learning. Number 4, being cursed with high expectations. And number 5, making toxic mixtures. And it's basically like all the chapters he mentioned before, but just like reversing them. like expectations. It's good to have expectations, but don't make them too high, because otherwise you'll like beat yourself down. And the frugality, he says, be frugal without being cheap. Leaving without learning is like, don't go into like a huge project without like knowing anything or learning anything. So those are the 5 injuries. I think the like 5 injuries he has there are like kind of forced a little bit. So I'm not going to go into those too much. You can read them if you check out the book. So with that, we'll just move on to chapter 9, which is workout. And this chapter is basically just a recap of the previous chapters, but he does have some pretty good recommendations in this chapter, which I'll go over right now. First off, he recommends being grateful, because study has shown that people that are more grateful, they're actually less economically impatient. So, because the study here showed that if people are more grateful for the money they have, then they're willing to wait longer to receive more money. You'll be able to defer less money today to get more money in the future. Where people that aren't grateful, they think they need the money right now. So that's just something to keep in mind. Another thing in this chapter, which is really cool, he talks about making a New Year's resolution. He said that people that make New Year's resolutions are way more likely to make positive changes in their life. And he recommends making a New Year's resolution any time of the year. Another thing he recommends in this chapter is changing your routine. Heard this other places too, like in You Are a Badass by Jen Sincero, she talks about changing your routine as well. And you do this so you can look at things from a different angle. And Jen Sincero and You Are a Badass says that you do this so that you can like not only change your routines and open your eyes, but like maybe you'll meet somebody that you need to meet, or you'll view something from a different angle. And he also recommends in this chapter hanging out with people outside of your area of expertise. Again, this is just to get a different perspective. And the last good thing he recommends in this chapter is letting your mind wander sometimes. You don't always have to be busy. The study shows that it's good to rotate between mindful work, like work that's stressful for your mind, to doing mindless work. So make sure to take a break every now and then from just doing mindful work, so you don't become so rigid in your thinking. So that's the summary of Stretch. I definitely recommend this book to anybody that's like trying to be creative, because sometimes we need constraints in order to be more creative. We don't always need more. You don't need more money to succeed. You can succeed right where you are. And I'll be including a link to my website where I have a summary of this book written up so you guys can reference it for the future if you want to. And give this a thumbs up if you liked it, and also subscribe. Thanks for watching.